Rivera.
Try to do this Zoom and get him acclimated to this book nook at the same time.
Welcome, everybody. This is Bettina Twerdig.
Bettina, we can't hear you. There you go.
I'm unmuted. Can you hear me now?
Yes, thank you.
All right. Hello, I'm Bettina Twerdig Riveros, Chair of the Vision Coalition and Chief Health Equity Officer and Chief Public Affairs Officer at Christiana Care, a leading health system in Newark, Delaware, in the U.S. Today, October 31st of 2023, we're hosting a webinar, The Future of Education, a virtual conversation with Andreas Schleicher from the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development. And we really appreciate everyone joining us today. You can advance the slide. I want to acknowledge, as the chair of the Vision Coalition, my fellow members. We're a diverse group representing school districts, charter schools, teachers, higher ed, community-based organizations, and school boards. We're really excited for the conversation today as we look to the future of education for our wonderful state of Delaware and learn from countries around the world, and frankly, record this so that others can use it in other states and for other education systems throughout the country. So some of you have been engaged in public education plan development in the past, going back to 2006, when our first plan was released from the Vision Coalition. And then again in 2015, when Delawareans teamed up with local, national, and international experts, including our wonderful guest, Andreas Schleicher, to develop a 10-year plan for Delaware public education, Student Success 2025, released in September of 2015. We have had 5 secretaries of education engaged in this work, 3 administrations, 4 business community leaders chairing the Vision Coalition. This composition really makes us unique and brings us together focused, frankly, on common ground, public education in our state, something to which all of us are deeply committed. As we approach 2025 and look to the future, the Vision Coalition is celebrating the success that we've collectively made. And you can see some of those high points here. Many of you were involved in that Student Success 2025 plan, and I really want to express not only my thanks, but the thanks of everyone in Delaware to you. Delaware has made progress on about 70% of the recommendations in that plan. We have a lot to be proud of, including early childhood, our educator workforce. You can see on the second bullet there, supporting students on what they're planning next. One highlight that I know Andreas will address is our career pathways. And those efforts, which have grown to a remarkable 26,000 students enrolled, represent more than half of our high school students. Currently, the Vision Coalition is doubling down and deeply committed to, frankly, our next phase of work, and that is addressing equitable funding in schools statewide. And thank you to the many of you who have been part of those conversations. We've hosted webinars and education sessions on our current funding system, how other states fund education, and what our opportunities look like as we move forward, hopefully toward a new funding system. The independent assessment report will be out in December, and we look forward to discussing how we can move the recommendations around equitable funding forward to support all students in the state of Delaware. So the goal for today is to look to the future, to learn from our counterparts around the world, and frankly, to think big as we consider 2035. It seems far away, but we've got a lot of work to do to prepare and to really serve all students and families in Delaware. We need to really double down and understand how we can support students, parents, families, and educators in the next decade. We're going to have two parts of the discussion today. One is on the future of education, and one is on where the U.S. is today, with time for discussion in between. Now I'm going to introduce Paul Herdman, who will introduce our speaker. Feel free to put questions in the chat as we go. We'll be taking a look at those and using those to fuel our discussion at midpoint and at the end. Thanks a lot. Paul?
Thanks, Bettina, and thanks for your leadership. I know folks know Bettina in a lot of roles, but she's been an amazing chair of the Vision Coalition and juggles a lot of things around this community and helps drive reforms on multiple fronts from healthcare to education. It's my pleasure to introduce Andreas, who is the Director for Education and Skills and Special Advisor on Education Policy to the Secretary General at the OECD in Paris. And he helped us actually develop the Student Success 2025 document back in 2015 as part of an international advisory group. And I actually had the pleasure this spring to serve on loan to the OECD for a few months, where I got a chance to see a bit of their work up close. And it's an amazing infrastructure and service to really the global conversation on a range of fronts, from not only education to healthcare and pretty much everything except for defense. They work on huge issues. So it's a great pleasure to introduce you, Andreas. And again, I think that the first part of this conversation is, since 2015, when we had this initial conversation, a lot has changed. Climate change has sort of risen to an apex. We've had global pandemics. We have AI introduced. So as we think about the future, what are some of the implications that we should be thinking about, and how should that inform our thinking? Get it, unmute. Sorry.
Thanks so much, Paul, and thanks also for inviting me. I've been always impressed by the Vision Coalition. You might think in the times in which we live, every state, every country would have, a coalition like this that frames the future. But actually, we're quite far from this. This is still quite exceptional to bring together, key stakeholders to model, to think about the future and to anticipate different versions of the future. So my congratulations to that. I'm really happy to be part of this. I'll just, share my screen just a second. I want to start, with something that we have all experienced. We were in the middle of a pandemic that has not just disrupted social services, but probably also our thinking about those kinds of services. It really sort of confronted us with, was a knock on the door that some things need to change. And, what is also very clear is that the future will always surprise us. Now, climate change, Paul, you already mentioned it, is going to disrupt our lives a lot more than this pandemic. And artificial intelligence creates so much uncertainty. And certainly in education, we know how to educate second-class robots, people who are very good at repeating what we told them. But in this time of, artificial intelligence, what makes us human? Those are really big questions that we will need to answer. And, you can list a whole number of, drivers that are going to change, the environment, the demand for skills, the supply of skills. And certainly since 2015, we live in a different world now. What's also very clear over the last years is that the kind of things that are easy to teach and test have also become easy to digitize, to automate. Now, you can see a massive decline in routine cognitive tasks. Now, in the 70s, we saw routine manual tasks, taken over by robots. Now we see routine cognitive tasks. Now, if you have a job that you can explain in the form of, a formula, tomorrow an algorithm is going to do it better than you. Now, we see a rise in technology-intensive tasks, and you put the two things together. Welcome to the future of work. Now, it's actually not rocket science. People debate about the speed, is technology going to destroy more jobs than it creates, or create more jobs than it destroys? That's probably an open question, but the direction of travel is pretty clear, and the implications for education are pretty clear. You know, one of the things that we do at the OECD is we assess the capabilities of young people on our global PISA tests. And now these days we ask ourselves, well, you know, how well does artificial intelligence do on those tests? And when we did that in 22, you know, last year, you could see in mathematics, you know, 28% of the tasks could be solved by artificial intelligence. And we did that again this year with GPT-4, and you can see, you know, suddenly 46% of the kind of things that we test kids in school with can be done by artificial intelligence. And this just shows the rapid pace of the evolution of technology. And, you know, we need to think harder. What makes us human in this world where the kind of things that are easy to teach and test have become easy to digitize? We see other evolutions as well. You know, you think about online labor, people seeking greater ownership over, you know, what they do and how they work and where they work and how they distribute, you know, work and living and so on. That's clearly a trend that is upon us. Or, you know, look at which companies are the most successful ones in this new economy. They are all companies of the intangibles. That is the real key here. It's not about technology. Technology is a tool. No, this is about knowledge. Entities that, you know, are engaged in the development, dissemination of knowledge. And that really means that skills are now the currency of modern economies now. These companies, you know, they have their products before they get their money, and they are not created by a big industry. They're created by a big idea. Now, that is really, I think, what drives our societies. You look at the, you know, traditional Fortune 500 success stories, they still exist, but, you know, they're moving lateral. They're no longer the engines of economic, of social development. And that has real implications. You know, this is a really interesting analysis. On the vertical axis, you have an assessment of the skills of adults. We do not just a PISA for students in school, we also do a regular assessment of the skills in the workforce. So the higher you up on the chart, the better skilled your workforce. And on the horizontal axis, I show you the risk of automation in economies. Now, the further you are at the right, you know, the more likely are you going to lose jobs. And you can see this, the two things are pretty well correlated. Now, the best protection against automation is not regulation, it's skilling people. Giving people the right skills to collaborate, to compete, to connect in ways that drive our economies forward. Now, that is our best bet, you know, against automation. One more trend, you know, it's social media. You know that really well. When I was, you know, going to school, life was pretty straightforward. You know, you read what you got in the school book and you were taught to believe, you know, to be true what you read. And today we are all authors of our own content. Now, we live in a world where knowledge and information is no longer produced by a few television anchors or a few newspaper editors, but we all throw our opinions into the mix. And that has created a very, very different world. But what does this mean for education? You know, it means that, you know, reading, for example, is no longer about extracting knowledge. It's about constructing knowledge. It's about distinguishing fact from opinion. It's about navigating ambiguity. And again, when we tested, you know, young people in school at age 15, how well can they do that? The picture is pretty sobering. Now you can see here on the left side, Singapore, Korea, parts of China, you have a good majority of 15-year-olds capable to navigate the digital world, distinguishing fact from opinion, you know, navigating ambiguity, managing complexity. But, you know, you go further to the right and you can see actually many countries, the majority of 15-year-olds are not ready for the world in which they are born. Now, to be born into the digital world does not make you a digital native. It takes really hard work. It takes effort. It takes good education to give people the skills actually to leverage the digital technologies. And that also explains why we see that increasing polarization in our societies, our economies. Now, those with the right skills never had the life chances they have today. But those who do not make the grade increasingly struggle. We see that polarization in our labor market, we see it in our economies, we see it in our societies, we see it on the political front. And that also shows that the past means that we had to deal with inequality, you know, money, No, you take money from the rich, give it to the poor, you sort of deal with the consequences of inequities. No longer work. No. The big challenge today is not just economic participation, it's social participation, civic participation. It all depends on education. I'm going to come back later when we talk more specifically about the US, but Paul, I think now is the moment to engage in discussion.
Yeah, so I want to just hear from folks if they have questions. Maybe Bettini may can surface some if they show up in the chat. But an initial question was, you mentioned something about what makes us human. We had a survey done of several hundred employers in Delaware, and they basically found that the things that they needed were new employees needed were digital literacy and what we call durable skills, which are sort of these teamwork type skills. I know that the OECD has got a framework around transformative competencies for 2030. Maybe just talk a little bit about what those entail.
Yeah, we look at three classes of competencies. One is your capacity to generate new ideas, to imagine, to innovate, to build new things. And that's entrepreneurship. This at the heart of this is really human agency. Can you mobilize your cognitive, social, emotional resources to do something? The second class that we look at is, our capacity to navigate ambiguity, to manage and reconcile tensions and dilemmas. The world is no longer black and white. Often we need to make up our own mind. We need to deal with conflicting interests, and that becomes increasingly difficult. We have an abundance of information and scarcity of attention in the world in which we live. So I think that capacity is very, very important. And then last but not least, again, putting it all together, being able to mobilize, being able to put into practice, to apply. If you master those three classes of competences, you probably have a good chance in tomorrow's world. And the last part is also, the last group also includes ethics. If you think about, artificial intelligence technology, that's not a magic power. It's just an amazing accelerator, an amplifier. It amplifies good ideas and good practice in the same way it amplifies bad ideas and bad practice. So that human capability to understand, to make judgments, to reflect, to think critically is very, very important as well. So those three groups of competences is what we would, put into this. No? But people have, different taxonomies but usually they coincide quite well.
Well, as we think about these shifts, one of the questions that just came up was around access and equity and inclusion. And as we think about inclusion and particularly providing equitable opportunities for individuals of all backgrounds and abilities, particularly those with disabilities, what are your thoughts about how those macro trends you described play out in terms of just better addressing inclusion?
I think that what is very, very clear is that the consequences of inequity economically, socially, are just much more dramatic now than they used to be in the past. In a way, you can say our labor markets, our economies, our societies used to be pretty tolerant towards inequalities. No? You could still get a job. You might not get a great salary, but you could get a job if you're not so highly skilled. And that space is shrinking dramatically. So even if we're not doing much worse now on inclusion than in the past, the consequences of that are so much more dramatic. And that's really why inclusion is no longer nice to have. It's really the core of a good, education and skilled systems. And that means, understanding how different people learn differently and finding ways to engage them on their own learning pathways. Now, in a way, giving people more ownership over what they learn and how they learn and when they learn and where they learn. In the past, we had a kind of one-size-fits-all approach to education. And we have to get much better at understanding really the nuances and the different approaches that people take towards learning. Now, some people learn, very well in a classroom setting. For them, the academic kind of learning styles are very well adapted. But it's also very clear that there are people who learn more in applied settings, in a more kind of social and a relational kind of environment. And we often do not do justice to them. And I think, having a broader range of learning environments that is more responsive to particular, individual preferences It's not just about social background, really. It's about, different modalities of learning, different interests of people, and having skill systems that are just a lot more personalized is really the future. Technology is probably going to assist us with this, but it's not the only answer. No?
I was just in Australia this spring, and they are working on electronic portfolios for each individual student that addresses how they learn and what they're learning along the way. Are you seeing that type of individualization happen in other countries, or are there other macro trends that should inform our thinking?
Oh, absolutely. And I wouldn't even put Australia, first. I was just in Korea, where students now have digital tutors. In a classroom, you do not longer raise your hand at random and get called on at random, but you actually have a tutor, very personalized, that understands how you learn and responds to this. You can get your personalized homework, not just homework that is done for everybody, but you can actually engage with this. We do see, I think, amazing solutions now in this. It's not, the philosophy of that is not new. Tutoring has always been, a very effective way of learning. It's been the most effective way for catch up after COVID. But in the past, it was just very expensive, very difficult to scale. That was always, the privilege of the rich who could afford it. But now we do have the possibility to actually, build a kind of very personalized approaches to learning that reconcile, high quality learning with equity and inclusion. But well, one must say, you talk still about very few countries where this is real. In many countries, we're still in a one size fits all, very industrial form of education and learning. So a long way to go.
Andreas, this is Bettina again. You talked about the best protection against automation being giving people the skills. Could you speak to the criticality of this work and this moment, this opportunity, as we think about economic and political stability or instability?
Yeah, I think you have, highlighted the main dimensions. The economic dimension is the easiest to understand. You can see that those with, the right skills get better and better salaries. Our labor markets are, good at extracting value from that, turn better skills into better jobs and ultimately better lives. I think the economic relationship between skills and outcomes has always been pretty clear, but what you can now add into the mix is the social dimension and the cultural and the political dimension. Basically, in the past, you could give poor people some money, some welfare, and they could, have a decent life. And in this modern, complex world, that no longer works. Basically, political participation is very closely linked to the skills of people. Civic participation is closely linked to the skills of people. So these are new phenomena that make really skills the currency of modern society, a currency that you can earn and develop in many different ways, not just in schools. I think great places of work these days are also great places of learning. And good places of learning, whether academic or not, are usually very good at anticipating the evolution of labor demands. I think that's one dimension, but with the prospects of people who struggle in this transition to the knowledge economy really face very dire consequences, and not just economically. Economically, you can always deal with that. Europe has very extensive and expensive social welfare system to address the economic inequality, but we see the same political, civic and cultural polarization now, and I think that's the probably the bigger challenge for the years to come.
Thank you. And do you see an opportunity or the potential for any of that low tech sector to be as we see students working in perhaps non-professional careers, but there to be a change in the value associated with those types of roles, or do they get closed out? Like is that a shift that needs to happen?
Yeah, I do think it needs to happen, but I think actually I would not associate generally academic ways of learning with high skills and other forms of learning with low skills. I think we need to get away from that notion that this is a hierarchy. We need to get more to a notion that these are different ways of learning and different types of skills. Our economies actually increasingly value social and emotional skills, and sometimes you actually acquire those skills better in an applied setting than in an academic setting. And I think we need to better recognize this to create more kind of a kind of pathways philosophy rather than a hierarchy where you basically say, well, you go to university to get a great job, or you do something else and then you end up with what's left for you. I actually think the future economy will be very, very different from that, and will encourage. You go to Singapore today, they have something that they call skills future. So everybody basically gets an entitlement when they are born, and you can use up that entitlement as you see fit. So you decide, what you want to do, how you want to learn, where you want to learn, whether you want to learn at the job or in an academic institution, and so on. And I think that's probably, and that combined with micro credentials is probably going to, make a real shift. The formal educational institutions are likely to lose part of their monopoly. They have become very powerful by bundling, educational content, delivery, and accreditation. That can, you can charge young people $10,000s for a degree, even though it may not be worth it. And in the future, that's going to be much harder. We're going to see much more kind of openness in those kinds of skill systems.
Well, certainly many pathways to acquiring knowledge, to education, to career advancement, and really provocative thinking, and the future that we need to address as we think about our vision for education for Delaware. So there's a question in the chat, and then after that we'll probably have to move along. Shane McKenzie shared what mindset or capability shifts are most critical to increasing the willingness to adopt digital technology within the education world, and how do we reduce some resistance across certain generations or demographics? Do you have any thoughts around that, to increasing that willingness to adopt digital tech?
I think, having a growth mindset, being open to change, being willing to unlearn and relearn, it's hard for us humans, and we must admit, we are all, we like to live in a world of certainty that is predictable, but I think we can actually do better in giving young people more of that resilience to be able to learn, to unlearn, to relearn, to be open to change. And I think that's the skill. Today, it's no longer enough to be a specialist in any kind of field. You need to have the capacity to become a specialist in a field that is unfamiliar to you and maybe unfamiliar to anyone. And I think these are things that we can educate. We often, educate people for certainty. We make them learn answers rather than to ask the right questions. And I think the more we can actually build and support that openness, that willingness to take risks, to make mistakes, and to learn from and with mistakes, I said, the more likely we're going to see actually people who later in life, when they encounter, the unforeseen, the change, to take a positive view on that.
Yeah, building that muscle of resilience through persistence, frankly, and then creating that capability to have that growth mindset. I may not be an expert in that now, but I can grow into that. It's terrific. Well, thank you. So, Paul, shall we move along to the next section?
Yeah, so I think we're going to now take a look at how the U.S. compares globally on a few fronts. So thanks.
Yeah, let's move sort of to start with the foundations. Actually, Paul, you highlighted in the slide the importance of early education in Delaware, and that's probably, one of the best investments that you can make in the future of your economy and your society. We see that all around the world. And here I don't show you Delaware, I show you the United States in comparison. And one must say the world has really passed the US by on that measure. The US, if you looked at this graph, 10 years, 15 years ago, the US was sort of a middle range performer in early years education. Today, it's pretty much at the end of the scale, not because things got worse, but because they got so much faster, better. Basically, most countries in the OECD have got that message that if you want to create a level playing field, if you want to, create a predictable future for people, you have to start really, really early. Now, many of the skills that are most important in the 21st century are actually built best in the early years. Creativity, resilience, empathy. For us as adults, they have become personality traits. They're very, very hard to change. But for a small child, those are real skills. We can teach them sometimes even better than math and science. And when you see here, for example, in most countries, basically every 4-year-old, in actually many countries, most of 3-year-olds are now enrolled in some form of early childhood education and care. And I want to highlight here education. A fair amount of provision in the United States is still primarily care-based. It's about, enhancing female labor market participation and all those things. But the question that we should ask ourselves is, to what extent does provision really serve the educational needs of children? To be ready, to be prepared, to develop the kind of foundations that are going to be so crucial. And they are very, very hard, honestly, to recuperate later in life. And as you can see from the chart here, most countries actually in the OECD now do considerably better than the US. And that's a fairly recent phenomenon. My own country, Germany, 20 years ago looked worse than the US. Early childhood education was, very patchy. Only few, people could afford it, would go for it. Was not even well regarded in society. Many people would say, well, if you can't take care of your children, today, as you can see, Germany is actually among the countries that are doing really, really well on this measure. UK, another example, last 10 years, massive shift towards creating better places. So I think Delaware is exactly on the right track here, but the US as a whole is still a long way to go. Money makes a difference. We can see, growing investments in the early years. I think that's been pretty clear as well in many countries. And these are real, big growth measures. Very, very few countries where you can see a decline in investment. So you can see this is an area where the world is moving. And I don't say this about schools or universities, because their progress has been much more modest over recent decades. But let's have a little look at schooling. Now, the first thing I want to look at is money. One of the things that you can see is that Delaware spends as much on a student in pre-primary or primary or secondary public education than the US. It's the neighbor here on the pink bar. So basically Delaware and the US are basically the same. And it's more than the OECD. The OECD is the right bar on the right side. So what you can say, actually, there's a lot of money going into education in the US in general, and in some of the states particular. And then you need to look at the PISA results and ask yourself, well, if there's so much money, why are the results not aligned with this? No? And you can ask yourself, is it about time? Are school days long enough? And the answer to that question is actually yes. When you look actually the compulsory instruction time in education, you can see the US is at the top end of the distribution. You have only Australia, Denmark, Costa Rica, and Colombia, which have longer school days. So you can't really make an argument that, there's a shortage of time. It's a lot more about productivity. Are the learning environments such that time is used effectively? And you can drill down by state as well, and you can make the case also for Delaware. Now, you can see very clearly that Delaware actually, even compared with the US that has already long school days, Delaware has even longer school days. So there is actually plenty of time available for learning now. So you can ask yourself now, well, if it's not money, if it's not time, what is it? And part of the answer is a lot of the money in the US goes in other things than the classroom. There's a lot of cost for infrastructure, there's a lot of cost for auxiliary services. But when you actually look at teacher salaries, the US ranks second lowest after Hungary when you compare salaries relative to what other people with tertiary qualifications go. And that's really, I think, is a big lesson to learn from high-performing education systems. Whenever they make a choice between a better teacher and a smaller class, they go for the quality of teachers. Now, they pay their people quite well. They hire fewer of them. They give them larger classes. Often these countries spend less money, but clearly they make teaching not just financially, but also intellectually attractive, so that they get the best and brightest people into the teaching profession, because the quality of education can never exceed the quality of teachers. I think that's pretty obvious. When you look at school leaders, there you can say actually they get quite more reasonable in the US. So that's, I think, something that to keep in mind. So spending overall is good. Instruction time is very good, but the trade-off, relatively poorly paid teachers against small classes is probably not the best choice to make if you want to improve the quality of learning environment. It's really a productivity question here. It's not a question of volume, neither money nor time. Let's have a brief look at tertiary education, post-secondary education. One thing to realize is that when you look at the employment of young people by educational attainment, having a high school degree is not a great thing. In some countries, it works very well. If you are in Norway or Switzerland or Estonia or Hungary, Netherlands, and so on, you can see most people with a high school degree actually getting jobs and often getting good jobs. But you can say in the US, actually, a high school degree is clearly not enough to get a decent living. Compared with, tertiary qualifications, there you can say the US is as good as any other country. So that's a very important message that, high school in the US is not sufficient. You have a lot of short cycle tertiary programs. Think about associate degrees. Now they are a good, and I would say actually an important element of professional education. In the US, very few countries where that is a bigger share. And also since 2015, we can see changes on this. But one caveat, when you actually look at the earnings of adults with short cycle tertiary degrees, like associate degrees, they're not great. Actually different from most countries where sometimes a short cycle qualification can be a good pathway into employment, into earnings. That is not true in the US. In the US, you can say actually, those kinds of qualifications are often substandard, or at least employers do not recognize them and pay for them as much as they would in other countries. So that's, I think, a signal that there's more work required to raise the aspirations, raise the status of those kinds of qualifications. Now, when you get a master's or a PhD, the US does fine. That's not where the problem is now. And I want to come back to an issue that I highlighted earlier. This is all about economic participation, salaries, employment, but there's also, a really interesting correlation when you actually ask yourself, who believes in conspiracy theories? You can see people who do not have a high school degree, the rates are very high. Those who have a high school degree, the rates are lower. The people who have a post-secondary degree actually have the lowest share of people believing in conspiracy theories. You can suddenly see, democratic participation is related to skills. Now, very, very important. You can also see here civic engagement. Now, do you take part, in a public demonstration? Do you actually volunteer or take part in non-profit and charitable organizations? You can see very clearly those with post-secondary qualifications are much more likely to engage themselves in those kinds of civic processes. And that really shows that we do not just talk about a kind of economic story here. We also talk about a civic, a social story where education plays an increasingly important role. Our modern world is just very, very difficult to navigate without those skills. And again, you risk in a world of artificial intelligence to become a slave of, algorithms and, ChatGPT if you do not have the skills to actually think critically, navigate complexity, be comfortable in ambiguity, and so on. Very last point I want to highlight, being ready for work. One of the things that we see very clearly from this chart is here that countries that have more young people opting for career and technical pathways generally have a better employment situation. Basically offering young people a broader mix of pathways, combining academic but also career and technical education pathways. Where you see a better mix, you can see that here on the horizontal axis, you generally also see better youth employment. So I think that's a really, really important point. It's not, one or the other. It's really about providing the mix now. And when you look at the US, it still is one of the very last positions on this when it comes to people in school. Of course, you have, in In the post-secondary world, there's a lot of career and technical education, but the US is one of the countries where that share in secondary education, in high school, is one of the lowest. If you look, for example, Austria, the Slovak Republic, Romania, Slovenia, France, Poland, Germany, you have 40–50% of people in high school opting for the more applied pathways. And they are not second standard. I want to highlight and stress that here. This is not about, people who are not capable to do, academic kind of skills. No, these are actually often very, very attractive for choices of young people. If you go to Switzerland, young people get subsidized to go to university. It's all free. You don't pay any fees. And still the majority of young people prefers a more applied kind of education because it's a lot more interesting to work, in a company with part of your time than just sitting in a classroom. But this is an area where you'd see really there's a lot of scope for the US to expand that share. Now, here I don't have data for the US, but I still want to show you this. When you talk about career and technical education, one big important question is, where does it take place? Is it just, about, going to a vocational school, or do you actually combine work and study? And you can see here on the left side, in Denmark, Hungary, Ireland, Latvia, Switzerland, Germany, it's very common for students. Most students would actually combine working and study. So they spend part of their time in a school and part of the time at the workplace. No? And actually, in many countries, that share is increased. And why is this important? Actually, when you look at the share of students in combined and school-based work programs here on the horizontal axis, and again, employment, you can see the big driver of the employment advantage doesn't come from the school-based component, but it comes from the work-based component. So actually giving young people access to the world of work, through internships or through work-based training or other forms, has a real benefit in terms of getting them into jobs. In a way, you cannot be what you cannot see. And to show, young people those kinds of possibilities is really important. So if I wrap that up, it's about adapting career and technical education and tailoring curricula to labor market trends. Germany, Portugal have done really well on this, giving young people the possibility to specialize in one field, in multiple fields, and do things they really, really have a passion for, where they can become really good at. Increasing openings in apprenticeship programs, sometimes providing even money for that. This is also a very effective way to address, gender imbalances. We know that, the most important career decisions you do not make when you graduate from school. You make those decisions on your career when you enter school. And particularly, socioeconomic stereotypes, gender stereotypes, they are very, very clearly visible among primary students. So giving people good advice, good guidance to see the world, to see the perspectives, particularly students from disadvantage who often have a very myopic view of the world of work, giving them really good tools is incredibly important. Some countries have also used money. Canada is a good example. They look at shortage occupations where there are gender imbalances and see sort of how they can compensate for this. But it's something really, really worth to consider. And then last but not least, I highlighted this already, strengthening employers' involvement in those kinds of programs. That is really the most essential thing that you can do. The more employers are engaged, not just in the delivery of those programs, but also in their design, the more likely you're going to get, young people opting for those programs and coming out of them with success. And I'll leave it here so that we have enough time for our discussion.
Great. A lot of opportunity for discussion. I'm just going to hit on a couple of questions. And if you actually go back to your first early childhood slide, there's a question just to unpack that some of the what the graphic is saying. But as we're moving in that direction, there was a question about recruitment of early childhood educators. They're traditionally not paid as well as traditional educators. And we are struggling, like a lot of other places, figuring out the best way to recruit those folks. So I think if we can go back a few more slides to the early childhood slide, the first one that was in the US comparison. There was a one way back we just wanted to kind of explain. But any thoughts on, just as you're doing that, the move towards recruiting early childhood educators? Any countries doing an exceptional job in that space?
Yeah, absolutely. Actually, you have a good number of countries now that would actually have almost the same requirements for staff qualifications in the early years than they would have in primary school, sometimes even secondary school. And there's a logic to
I think
this.
that's it.
You might think that, it's easier to teach small kids, but actually, science says it's actually one of the hardest things to get right. And the diagnostic capabilities you need to have, the content knowledge, and that is a massive challenge. To some extent, it's about pay, now to adjust pay scales, but to a large extent, it's really about the kind of training opportunities that shift emphasis from access to quality and from care to education. I do believe we have seen some really, really positive changes here. Sometimes you have to make choices. England, for example, says, well, we can't afford to give every, teacher in early childhood education and care a great education. So we have few of them in every institution, and then provide some assistance with lower qualifications. But it's very, very important to have highly trained and qualified staff to support children. It's also very important to look at outcomes. In a way, you can say, a lot about what happens in a primary school. No? Basically, you have a curriculum. You know the qualifications of staff. You know how well they are paid. You know something about class size. I don't think in the US you can take any of that for granted for the early years. Basically, you have a mix of qualifications. There is no genuine curriculum. Now, we do not know what happens. It's basically up to educators at the front line. And I think to provide a bit more structure, a bit more kind of architecture behind that is a good start. You can't overnight change the qualifications of people. That's a kind of long haul effort. But what you can certainly do is provide more, curricular guidance to give, educators better tools, better kind of access to professional development. Those are the kind of things that actually are not so difficult to do and quite influential.
Thank you. And just to unpack this slide, I think there was a question just to understand the graphic. So if we just look at the United States, that first triangle means that 30% of students are accessing education at age 3. What is it, like 60% or so age 4? So maybe just unpack what that slide means for an American looking at this slide.
Yeah, it's essentially the participation rate in early childhood education and care for the different age groups. So you can basically say for 3-year-olds, you talk about 30%, for 4-year-olds, you talk about 50%, and that's really very low by international standards. If you were in France and even in Mexico, you would have 80% of 4-year-olds in early childhood education and care. Now, if you are in Ireland, you'd have close to 100%. So 50% of 4-year-olds or 30% of 3-year-olds is really low by international standards.
Yeah. And there was one other question. Thank you for that. Just in terms of, you wouldn't have to go to the slide, but there was a reference to the amount of money being spent per student in various countries. And there was a question as to the data source for that. That's our education at a glance. We basically aggregate those data every year and publish them in our publication, Education at a Glance. This is looking at all money that goes to the educational institutions. It's not counting money that parents may spend, for tutoring or other resources. It's basically the amount of resources, public and private, that goes into educational institutions. Yeah. I have just one other question, and Bettina, you may have another question before we need to wrap up. But as you think about this group of Delawareans looking to the next 10 years, and you think about where we could prioritize our political and financial resources, any broad suggestions as to things to think about? Obviously, you probably have to have a lot more information to make more targeted recommendations, but any sort of broad recommendations as you think about where we might want to prioritize our resources and time?
Yeah, I mean, you have a good starting point. I mean, overall, spending on education is quite good in Delaware and the US. So I think it's good to have money. But if I would, prioritize, I would, put a lot more resources into the early years, maybe save later in learning, but ensure really that there's a level playing field. Second, I would, pay more attention that money is better aligned with needs. Most countries are now using formula-based funding mechanisms where you basically model the money that a school gets for a student based on the social, geographic, and other backgrounds that students at schools come from. And I think that's really, really important. It's not, spreading money equally through the system, but ensuring that money makes a difference where it can make most of a difference. Now, if you come from a wealthy background, school doesn't make that much of a difference for you. If you come from a poor background, you just have, one single chance in life, and that is to get a great teacher and find a good school. So aligning resources with needs. And then when it comes to the nature of spending, I would always prioritize the quality of teaching over things like the size of classes or infrastructure. Now, really, I think put more resources to ensure that every student has access to great teaching. And some of that you can leverage with technology, but it's very, very hard to short circuit that. It's really about the quality of the workforce from the early years. And so those three things are ones that I really believe are important. I applaud your effort to strengthen early childhood education. Once again, I think the earlier you start with your investments, the more likely you're going to see good returns on them.
And
Thank you very much.
Andreas, that focus is certainly one of our highest priorities of the Vision Coalition. And as we look to 2035, focusing on early childhood education, as you said, focusing on education rather than just care, and the high quality of the childhood educators in those spaces to really lift us up. Can you speak to then that investment, and then how that, and I expect it's just foundational, but leading to thinking critically, navigating complexity, some of that being comfortable with ambiguity, some of those skills that you talked early on about us all needing and our students needing in order to succeed in, frankly, a new world.
Yeah, I think this is a question of the curriculum, and in a way, the biggest challenge is not to teach these things in addition to what we teach, but actually to teach fewer things at greater depths. In a way, I would say, if I look at the US curriculum to the extent that we have analyzed it, and I must say we have not done that analysis for Delaware, but wherever we have done it, we found that often learning is a mile wide and an inch deep. You have lots of stuff being taught at relatively shallow depths, and really the challenge is to teach fewer things at greater depths. What you remember from science instruction in school probably is the experiment that you did, not what teachers told you. And so giving students more real experience and teaching few things to deepen conceptual understanding. Can you think like a scientist as opposed to what you just know in physics and chemistry? Can you think like an historian? Do you understand how the narrative of a society has emerged, developed, advanced, and sometimes unraveled, rather than just learning names and places? I think there's a lot that we can do to make learning more authentic, more problem-based, more project-based, and therefore more interesting and engaging for young people.
I need to jump on that real quick. I know we're getting to your time, then I'll leave it to you, to Bettina, to wrap up. But you were an accomplished musician, and we often think about the transition from high school into jobs, and that we can kind of lose the liberal arts. And there's a discussion about the sciences. So, like, in terms of thinking about what we should be teaching in terms of being ready for this very rapidly changing world, how do the arts and the sciences fit into our traditional math and reading as we think about being ready for the future?
Yeah, I do believe, and particularly in the world we live, creative subjects like the arts are incredibly important for people. And in a way, I think, I studied violin when I was a child, and it didn't just teach me the arts and music, but it also taught me to be resilient, to study hard, to practice, to understand that actually you have to invest many hours of time to do something really, really well. So I think actually we should look at, in the same way, people think, oh, well, sports is just to be athletic, but sports can teach you to take responsibility for yourself, take responsibility for other people, develop courage, leadership. And I think that's the way we should think about those subjects, that they're not, ends in themselves, but they're actually means to develop the kind of knowledge, skills, attitudes, and values that really matter in our century.
And just related to that, there was a targeted question around the sciences. Is there anything on that front you'd like to add?
Yeah, I mean, I think science, particularly in the times in which we live, is that kind of most critical kind of subject. In fact, I think, a better science education could be one of the best investments we make in the future of the planet. We have actually very good data from our PISA assessment where students lack good science knowledge. They often believe that, tomorrow is going to be a magic politician solving the climate problem, so I don't need to change my behavior. Whereas students who have a really good foundation in science actually understand the world around them. They actually, are willing to take responsibility for the future. So I think actually a really good science education, but this is not loading people up with, physics and chemistry. It's really about engaging them in the scientific problems of our times. No?
Yeah. Well, Bettina, I'll leave it to you to close this out.
Well, thank you so much. And Andreas, vielen Dank to our friend. I want to just express all of our gratitude to you for sharing your expertise, your guidance, as we really collaborate, work together to create a vision and see how we can execute on the vision for education in Delaware, learning from all of your expertise, what's happened in other countries, how we can invest in early childhood education, develop those analytical and critical thinking skills that we need, that our students will need to be successful in the future, and frankly, to support society and a fair and just society for all, inclusive of all the efforts around equity and education funding that we're so committed to. So incredibly grateful to you and your commitment of time to help guide us here in Delaware. And certainly a lot to unpack and think about. And I'm thrilled that we have this recorded for future reference. I know I'll be watching at least. So thank you so much. As far as, so sorry to interrupt you. As far as other comments for the group, please participate in the survey that the Vision Coalition leadership team has out around what you believe is important in education as we look at developing that 2035 plan. We really need your input at the front end of this work. This will be an opportunity for everybody to share your thoughts. This is our collective plan. The link to that survey is in the chat. Please take a look at that. Please engage with us, and please reach out to the Vision Coalition or to any of us for further information. Really grateful to all of you. Again, Andreas, thank you so much. We're so grateful to you, and frankly, value your insights tremendously.
Thank you for hosting me.
Thank you.